She was taller than every man in town. A blacksmith asked her to marry him. The hammer was the first thing. Always the hammer. I'd pick it up in the dark before the forge was lit, just to feel it, the way another man might take a drink first thing in the morning to remind himself he was still alive. Mine was heavier than the stock ones, 3/4 inch more at the face, custom poured by a Swede in Laramie who I never saw again after that winter, and it sat in my hand different from anything else in the world. Balanced wrong to anyone who hadn't grown into it. Balanced exactly right to me. I'm telling you this because of what she said later, but I'll get there. My name is Cole Briggs. I ran the only smithy in Haskell Crossing, territory of New Mexico, from 1881 until now, far as that goes. The shop sat at the south end of the main street, which meant the wind came straight down the canyon and hit the open front of the forge at an angle that fanned the coals when I needed them hot and killed them dead when I didn't want it to. I fought that wind for 11 years. I never did win. You learn to work with a thing like that. You get stubborn about it for a while, then you get smart about it, then finally you just get used to it and you stop noticing whether you're winning or losing. You're just working. That's a pretty fair description of how I spent those first 11 years in Haskell Crossing. Just working. I was not a man that women noticed, except to notice that I was in the way. I'm not saying that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm just telling you the truth of it. I was 6'3", which in those days put me near the ceiling in most rooms, and I had the kind of face that a forge and a fistfight and 20 years of outdoor living builds for a man. Not a handsome face, not a villainous one, just a big weathered face that took up more space than people expected and made them uncomfortable if they had to hold it in view too long. My hands were the worst, or the best, depending on what you needed. They were not hands that belonged in a parlor. Women saw them and they thought of work and grime and calluses, and they were right to think that, because that was all those hands had ever known. But here's the thing about a smith that no one tells you if you haven't lived it. You know iron. You know it in a way that goes past skill into something else, something like feeling. You can tell by the color of the heat whether the metal will hold or crack. You can feel through the hammer handle whether the strike landed true or whether you're fighting the grain. Iron has a character to it. Every piece is different from the last, different in how it takes heat and how it holds shape and what it's willing to do under pressure. After long enough, you stop thinking about it. You just know. I did not know that what I had in my hands would ever matter to a woman, but it did, to her, and I'll get there. She came to Haskell Crossing in the second week of October, 1888, on the southbound stage from Santa Fe. I didn't see her arrive. I was at the forge, which was where I was most hours that God sent, and I heard the stage come in the way I always heard it, the 6-horse team at a hard trot, the driver's call, the brake catching on the iron shoe I'd fitted 3 months prior and fitted again in August when Lonnie Garrett drove it into a wash and bent the whole left side. The stage stopped. I heard the door. I heard boots on the planking, and that was all I heard because I had iron in the fire, and I wasn't about to let it go cold for the sound of a stagecoach. I found out about her the way I found out about most things in Haskell Crossing, which was that someone came to the smithy and told me. In this case, it was Hector Baines, who ran the general store across from the stage office and who had made it his personal mission in life to know the business of everyone in the county before they knew it themselves. He came at the end of that afternoon, just before I was closing the bellows down, and he leaned against the door frame in that way. He had one shoulder, arms crossed, the look on his face like he was doing you a favor by being there. You see the woman who came in on the stage? I was pulling a shoe blank from the coals with the tongs. No. Edith Crane, he said, widow out of Colorado. She's taking the Alderman house, bought it by letter, apparently, paid cash. She's going to start a dressmaking concern. I set the blank on the anvil and picked up the hammer. Hector, I'm working. She's tall, he said. I hit the blank. Once, twice, turned it, hit it again. The ring of it filled the shop and he waited it out, because Hector Baines had no sense of when he wasn't wanted. "How tall?" I said. He thought about it. "Taller than Whitmore, maybe close to you." I turned the blank again and hit it. "Women don't like being tall," I said. "Makes them feel wrong about themselves." "I imagine," Hector said, "you ought to go introduce yourself." "I imagine not." He uncrossed his arms and shifted off the door frame. "Cole, you haven't said more than 30 words to a woman in the 8 months I've known you." "I've said plenty of words to women. They don't care to hear them." He left. I finished the shoe. I saw her the next morning. I'd come out to the water barrel at the side of the shop, hands black with scale and my apron still smoking a little from a spark that had caught the hem, and she was walking up the main street on the opposite side, walking the way tall women who have made peace with being tall walk, which is straight-backed and deliberate, and taking up the space they're entitled to. She had dark hair pinned up, a gray dress that had some traveling dust on it still, and she was carrying a bolt of cloth under one arm like it was nothing, though a bolt of good wool runs to 14, 15 pounds. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her height, though she was tall 5'11" or 6 feet, which made her taller than every man on that street except me and possibly old Gus Harker, who was 6'1" in his boots. The first thing I noticed was how she was carrying that bolt. Straight, easy, no adjustment of her grip, no leaning into it. She'd been carrying weight her whole life and it showed. Not in a labored way, just in a way that meant she knew what her body could do and she didn't argue with it. She walked past the front of the general store and she turned her head and looked at me. Not long, just a second, the way anyone glances at a smithy because there's noise and fire and it draws the eye. But she didn't look startled or dismayed the way some women did when they saw me at that size in that doorway with those hands. She just looked, the way you look at something that is what it is, and then she looked back ahead and kept walking. I went back inside. I thought about her off and on, the way you think about something that snagged your attention without your permission. I didn't put a name to it. I was not a man who was in the habit of noticing women and then building something from that noticing, because, in my experience, the building came to nothing. I was good at what I did. I was large and reliable, and I didn't drink past my limit, and I paid my debts. But I had never been the kind of man that women pictured themselves beside. I knew that by then. 11 years of knowing will settle a thing in you. So I let it go and I worked. She came to the smithy 4 days later, a Thursday afternoon. I heard her before I saw her, the flat, assured step of someone who knows where they're going, not the tentative half-step most women used when they came to the shop, like they were afraid they'd gotten the wrong door and might be asked to leave. I looked up from the vise where I was dressing a set of hinges for the hotel's new dining room doors. She was standing at the threshold, one hand on the door frame, holding a latch plate. Old iron, badly pitted, the hardware from a trunk or a chest of some kind. She held it out. "I was told you do repair work," she said, "not just horses." "I do most iron work," I said. "This latch is the only one that fits my workroom door. I can't find the mate for it in town. Can you match it?" I crossed to her and she held it out and I took it. It was old colonial ironwork, probably 40 years old, the kind of hand-forged latch you didn't see anymore because the stamped machine goods had put the hand forgers out of business. Good work. Heavy. The plate had a particular profile at the catch end, a double shoulder that was individual to whoever had made it. "I can match it," I said. "Give me 3 days." "What will it cost?" I turned the plate over and looked at the back, where the original maker had left a slight hammer scar in the iron, not a defect, just a mark of where the last blow had landed before it cooled. Every smith leaves those. They're different for every hand. 75 cents, I said. "That's fair." She reached into her coat pocket. "I'll pay half now." "You don't have to do that." "I always pay half in advance when I hire work," she said. "It tells the tradesman I mean it, and it tells me whether the tradesman will take it or make a fuss about it." I looked at her. She was looking at me, not up at me the way most women did, because she didn't have to look up much. Her eyes were level and gray, and she wasn't testing me. She was just telling me a fact. "I'll take it," I said. She put the coins in my hand. Her fingers were long, and there was a small callus at the base of her index finger on the right hand, the kind you get from shears or from a seam ripper used daily. 3 days, she said, and she left. I held the latch plate and looked at it for a moment, and then I went back to the vise. Her name was Edith Crane, and she had been born in Wisconsin and had come west with her husband, a man named Robert Crane, who had run a freight operation out of Pueblo until the railroad undercut him, and then ran a hardware supply business until a winter fever took him in 1885. She had no children. She had packed what she owned and come to New Mexico because the land was cheap and dry, and she did not do well in cold, and because she had a skill and a plan and no intention of depending on anyone else for the rest of her life. I found out most of this over the following weeks because Haskell Crossing was a small town and information moved through it the way water moves through sand, slow and everywhere at once. She was not unfriendly, people said. She was not warm either. She answered what you asked her, and she ran her business, and she attended the Sunday service, and she went home. Men did not approach her mostly. The ones who had looked at her that first week and thought something about the situation had found, upon closer inspection, that she was not approachable in the ways they were used to. She was not cold exactly, but she was complete. That was the word I kept arriving at. She was a complete person who did not have an obvious opening for anyone to step into, and men who were used to women having those openings, the ones left by loneliness or need or a fear of being without protection, found that Edith Crane had closed hers up, or maybe had never had them in the first place. I brought her the matched latch plate on the 3rd day, as promised. I'd made it as close as I could, same weight, same shoulder profile, same hand-forged texture. I hadn't polished it because the original wasn't polished, and a polished mate next to a dark original would look wrong. She turned them both in the light from the front window of the Alderman house, one in each hand. I watched her check the weight balance, the fit of the plate edge, the catch profile. She knew what she was looking at. She wasn't pretending to inspect it. She was actually inspecting it. "You match the weight," she said. "I try to." Most smiths would have just made the shape and called it done. "The weight matters," I said. "A door doesn't care what it looks like. It cares whether the hardware feels right when you open it." She looked at me, the same level look she'd given me in the shop. Then she looked back at the plates. "It's good work," she said. "Better than I expected." She paid me the balance and I left. I thought about the way she'd said that, better than I expected, and I decided she wasn't insulting me. She was just precise. She said what she found without dressing it up or down. I had the feeling that she'd say the same thing about a bolt of cloth or a well-made pie crust. The thing was what it was. That was worth noting. October went and November came, and the temperature dropped the way it does in that country, not gradually, but in 2 or 3 lurches, like something being shut down in stages. The first cold night the canyon made a sound I'd learned over 11 years to interpret. A low, sustained note from the rock walls as they contracted, the sound of the land tightening around itself like something preparing for what was coming. I heard it from the cot in the back room, and I lay there and listened and thought about the forge and the iron work in the queue, a set of fireplace cranes for the hotel, a pair of candle brackets for the church, a run of fence pins for the Mortensen spread that I'd been promising for 2 months. I thought about other things too, that I didn't particularly want to think about. I got her the work on the shop windows. She had them put in wrong and the frames were pulling away from the sill on the west side, and I refitted the hinges on the back door, and I came twice to fix the stovepipe when it pulled a join loose in the wind. Small work. I was not manufacturing reasons to be there. The house was old and it needed tending, and I was the man in town who could tend iron, so I went when she sent for me. Between those visits, I watched her from the distance of ordinary town life, the way you watch something that catches your attention without meaning to. I saw her at the general store, moving through the narrow aisle between the bulk goods and the dry groceries with the patience of a person who is used to navigating space that wasn't built with her in mind. I saw her at the well at the south end of the street. She'd come in the early morning before the queue formed, the way people who lived alone and organized their own time often did, drawing the bucket up with both hands and her spine straight, not struggling with the weight of it, just working. I saw her once at the far edge of town where the road bent south, standing at the fence line of the alderman property looking at something in the distance, nothing around her but the flat winter grass and the sky, and she stood there a long time like she was measuring something she couldn't quite reach. I didn't speak to her in those moments. There was no reason to, and I was not a man who manufactured reasons. What I did was note them, the way you note things that matter and don't yet know why. I heard things about her too, not gossip, not quite. More the low current of opinion that ran through a town when a new person arrived and was being assessed. She was good at her work. Everyone agreed on that. A dress she'd made for the mayor's wife had been shown at the church social, and people had admired the way the bodice sat, the evenness of the seaming, the fact that it looked like something you might see in a catalog from back east instead of something run up in a territorial town by a woman with a cutting table in her front room. She was fair in her dealing. She didn't extend credit past what she could afford to lose, and she didn't take on work she couldn't finish on time. And both of those things were rarer than they should have been in a town where everyone was always a little short and a little behind. But she kept herself at a particular distance. Not unfriendly, people said again, the same word always. Not unfriendly, just complete. A woman who had made her own life and was not advertising for help making it over. Men read that differently depending on who they were. Some of them read it as a challenge. Some of them read it as a loss. The land office man read it as a problem to be solved, which was the wrong reading and would prove to be, though not yet. I read it as sense. She didn't know anyone in this town yet. She was building something from the ground up in a new place, and she was doing it carefully, and she wasn't going to let any random person step into the middle of that and knock it sideways. I understood the logic of it. It was how I'd built the smithy, one solid piece at a time, nothing added before the base beneath it was ready to hold it. We talked during the work the way you talk when there's a task running between you, not at each other but alongside each other, with the work as the point and the conversation running around the edges of it. She would tell me what was wrong and I would look at it and tell her what I thought, and she would say whether she agreed. She usually agreed. When she didn't, she told me why, and she was usually right. The second time I came for the stovepipe was in late November, a cold gray afternoon, and the problem was the same join. The collar was undersized for the pipe by about 1/16 of an inch, not enough to see but enough to matter when the pipe expanded with the heat and the join walked loose. I'd brought a wider collar this time, fitted for the actual pipe, and while I was up on the roof fitting it, she handed me up tools from below through the roof hatch when I called for them. She knew what I'd need before I called for it most of the time. She'd see where I was in the work, and she'd have the next tool ready. When I came back down, I said, "You've done this before." "My husband's freight wagons," she said. "Blacksmith hardware, axle hardware, hook hardware, chain hardware." I learned what questions to ask. "You learned more than the questions," I said. "I watched a lot," she said. "I find I remember what I watch." I found that I liked talking to her, not in a dizzy way, in the way you like using a good tool, clean, no wasted motion, goes where you aim it. She didn't talk in circles. She didn't ornament things for the sake of it. She said what she meant, heard what you said, and if she had something to add, she added it. If she didn't, she was quiet, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. I did not tell her this. I did not tell her anything of the kind. I was a working tradesman and she was a client, and that was all it was, and I was not going to be one of those men who mistook professional courtesy for something warmer and made a fool of himself. But I thought about her in the evenings, when the forge was cooling and I was cleaning the shop. I thought about the way she held that bolt of cloth. I thought about the callus on her right index finger. I thought about the latch plates and the way she'd weighed one in each hand to check the balance, like she knew already what good ironwork felt like. I thought about her standing at the fence line at the south end of the street in the cold, looking at something far out that I couldn't see from where I was. I knew by then, in some trouble. The thing happened in December, first week, on a Saturday. There was a man in town, I won't give you his name, but he ran the land office, and he was the kind of man who kept his shirts pressed and his hair combed, and believed that these facts entitled him to certain things. He'd been watching Edith Crane since she arrived, the watching of a man who has decided he's going to get something and is just waiting on the right moment. I was at the general store picking up a spool of tie wire when I heard him. He was in the street outside the dressmaking shop talking to her on the steps. I stopped by the window. I wasn't hiding. I was looking. She had something in her hand, a length of fabric, I think, something she'd been showing a customer, and he was standing too close, his hat at a tilt he thought was charming, saying something I couldn't hear through the glass. I watched her face. It was the still face she wore when she was deciding something, not angry, not flattered, just reading the situation. He said something and she shook her head, short, clear. He said something else and he reached for her arm, not hard, not violent, but the gesture of a man who does not accept that the answer has already been given. And she stepped back one step and said something that I could see was said at a volume that meant she was done with the softness of the exchange. He left, but not without a look back at her that said he was just postponing. I put the wire back on the shelf and I went outside. She was already going back through the door of the shop. I called her name, Mrs. Crane, and she turned on the step. "You all right?" I said. She looked at me a moment. "Yes." "He bother you again, let me know." She didn't answer right away. She had that still look. Then she said, "I've been managing men who can't take no for an answer since I was 17 years old, Mr. Briggs. I'm not sure what you think you'd add to that." It wasn't cruel, it was just honest. And she was right, she had managed him clearly without any help from me. I'd offered something she hadn't asked for. "Fair enough," I said. She looked at me a beat longer than I expected. Then she said, "Come inside a minute." The shop smelled of wool and pressed seams, and the particular flat warmth of a parlor stove. There were bolts on the shelves along the wall, and a cutting table that she'd built herself from lumber she'd gotten from the mill. I knew because I'd fitted the iron corner braces for her, weeks before, when she'd sent me the measurements by note and said bring the braces and the screws. There was a dress form in the corner with something in pale green pinned to it, half done. She put the fabric down on the table, and she turned around, and she looked at me the way she looked at ironwork she was evaluating. "Why do you offer to help?" she said. "You do it every time, the windows, the stovepipe, the door. You're always here before I have to ask twice." "Because the work needs doing," I said. "That's not all of it." I looked at the window. Outside the street was empty in the cold. "No," I said, "that's not all of it." She waited. I looked back at her. "I find I like the work when it's for you. I like talking to you when there's something between us to talk about. I think you're a capable person, and I think you're honest, and I think you don't waste my time or yours." I stopped. Then I said, "That's all I'm saying. I'm not asking for anything." She was quiet for a moment. She picked up the fabric from the table and turned it in her hands, smoothing a fold. It was the thing she did when she was thinking. I'd noticed it before. "You don't make me feel like I should be smaller," she said. I didn't say anything. "Most men do," she said. "Not on purpose, mostly. But they look at me and they think something has gone wrong, that I'm too big, too sure of myself, too much. Even the ones who say they don't think that you can see it. They want me to make myself less so they feel more. She set the fabric down. You look at me like I'm exactly the right size. You are, I said. She held my eyes. I'm aware you mean that literally. I mean it both ways. Something shifted in her face. Not much. Not a smile, not quite, something quieter. She looked down at the cutting table, then back up. Go back to your shop, Mr. Briggs, she said. Come on Sunday, I'll have dinner on. I did not sleep well that Saturday night. I lay on the cot in the back room of the smithy. I'd been sleeping there since September when the boarding house raised its rate. And I stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind come down the canyon the way it always did, and I thought about what had happened and whether I was reading it right. I was good at reading iron. I was not always good at reading people, and I knew it. But she had asked me to Sunday dinner. That was a fact that didn't need reading. That was a fact that just was. She made a pork roast with dried apples and onions and cornbread, and a pot of coffee that was stronger than anything I'd had since the army. The table was small, a working table, not a company table, and we sat across from each other close enough that, when she reached for the bread, she almost touched my arm. I'd come in my church suit, which I thought about on the walk over and then thought it was probably right. She was wearing a plain dark dress that was clearly her own work. The collar fitted exactly, the sleeves sitting at the right length, nothing pinned or estimated. She'd taken care with it. We were both, I realized, taking this seriously. We talked for 3 hours. I mean that simply, we talked for 3 hours, and I did not feel the time. She told me about Pueblo first. The freight business had been her husband Robert's idea and her husband's execution, but she had kept his books and she had known, before he did, when the railroad would take the volume they were counting on and not leave enough to run the operation. She had told him. He had not quite believed her, the way Robert had often not quite believed her. Not out of meanness, she said, just out of a particular form of confidence that some men have, the kind that isn't arrogance exactly but is still impervious to outside information when the information doesn't fit what the man already expects to find. He wasn't a bad man, she said. She said it without sentimentality. He was a man who thought he understood things better than he did. There are a lot of those. There are, I said. He tried the hardware supply because he thought he understood hardware. He understood it somewhat, enough to not go under quickly. She took her coffee. The fever came the winter of '85. It went fast. I won't dwell on that. I didn't push her to. She had packed 3 trunks, her clothes, her shears and cutting tools, some bolts of fabric she couldn't sell because she'd been making things for herself for years and had a good stock. And she'd had the cutting table disassembled and crated and put in the luggage car, which had required some negotiating with the station master in Pueblo who didn't think a cutting table was a personal effect. She'd prevailed. She usually prevailed, she said, when she thought she was right. New Mexico, I said. Why here? I had been cold enough, she said. Wisconsin cold, Colorado cold, mountain cold, river cold, the kind of cold that gets into the joints and stays. She looked at the window, which was dark by then, and outside the canyon was doing its evening thing with the wind. And I wanted somewhere I could start something small and have room to grow it. Towns that are already set don't want a new dressmaker. They have one. Towns that are still becoming their space. Haskell Crossing is still becoming, I said. I thought so, she said. I was right. I told her about the Swede and the hammer, which I hadn't told many people because it was the kind of detail that didn't mean anything unless you knew what the work was like, and most people didn't. She leaned forward a little when I described the weight of it, the extra 3/4 inch at the face, and she said, "That's a serious decision. Most smiths wouldn't bother." I said I'd known the difference would matter before I could have explained why, and she nodded like that made sense to her, like she'd made the same kind of decisions herself. I told her about the war, not the war itself, but coming out of it, The particular poverty of a man who has only his labor to sell and isn't sure yet what his labor is worth or where to sell it. I'd worked a mine in Colorado for 2 years after. Then a larger smithy in Denver for 3 more, under a man named Hobbs who was the best smith I've known and who paid fair and taught me everything he knew about working big iron, wagon hardware, mining equipment, the structural work that towns needed as they built up. Then the chance in Haskell Crossing, a town that had a horse population and no smith, and I'd come down and looked at it and decided this was where to put the stake. 11 years, she said. 11 years. And you built it one piece at a time. There's no other way to build it, I said. She was quiet a moment. The cornbread was gone and the roast was down to the bone, and neither of us had moved to clear the table. The lamp between us was burning low, and neither of us moved to trim it. There are moments in a conversation where the practical things stop mattering for a while, and this was one. I'll tell you what I think about this town, she said. I think it's a town that knows what it needs and doesn't always know how to value what it has. You've kept every horse and wagon and piece of equipment in this county running for over a decade, and half of them don't know your name past the smith. They know your work by what it does, not by who made it. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. That's not unusual, but it's a waste. I said, I don't need the credit. I know you don't, she said. That's exactly what I'm talking about. We sat with that a while. She told me about the first night in the alderman house, the window latch she couldn't work, the one that had brought her to me a few days later. She'd tried it for 10 minutes, she said, and it wasn't sticking or stiff. It was simply the wrong kind of latch for the hand, designed by someone who'd never thought about the angle at which a person reaches for a latch when they're carrying something or coming in out of weather. She'd found a bit of scrap wire in the kitchen and rigged a loop that she could hook with one finger, and she'd used that for 2 weeks before she got to me. Did it work? I said. It worked perfectly, she said. Wire is underestimated. It is, I said. I have a lot of customers who'd rather buy a new piece than fix the old one with wire. Costs them twice what it needs to. People don't like solutions that look improvised, she said, even when the improvised solution works better. She listened the way she looked at ironwork, straight at it, not waiting for you to finish so she could speak, actually listening. If she had a thought, she held it until you were done, and then she gave it to you plainly, and it was usually worth the wait. When I said the thing about the wind, about finally stopping fighting it and just learning to work with it, she nodded slowly and said, You get stubborn about it for a while, and then you get smart, and then you just get used to it. She was quoting me back to myself. I'd said that, weeks ago, to Hector Baines in the doorway while she was somewhere else entirely. I hadn't said it to her. But she'd heard it, remembered it word for word, and now she was giving it back. I looked at her. You remember things, I said. I remember things that seem true, she said. I sat with that a minute. The coffee was cold in my cup. Outside, the wind was working on the canyon again, the long, low complaint of it, the sound I'd lived with for 11 years. Mrs. Crane, I said, Edith. It was the first time I'd used her given name. I think you know what I'm circling around. I know, she said. I'm going to say it plain. I'd rather you did. I'm 41 years old and I have a smithy and a cot in the back room and 2 suits, one working and one I wear to church. And I am not a man who makes a woman's life easier by being in it mostly. I'm large and I'm loud and I smell like coal smoke most of the time, and I don't have the kind of hands that look right at a dinner table. I stopped. The wind went on. But I think you're the best person I've met in 11 years in this county. I think you're honest and capable, and you don't need anything from me that I can't actually give you. And I think you'd have a better shop if the ironwork were done by someone who cared about getting it right. I looked at her. I'm asking you to marry me. If you think there's anything in that worth considering. She was very still. Cole, she said. It was the first time she'd used my given name, too. I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way it might sound. Go ahead. I have had one man ask me to marry him in the last 3 years. He was shorter than me, which wouldn't have mattered, but he was the kind of shorter that made him angry. He wanted me to walk behind him. He wanted me to agree with him in public even when he was wrong, and he was wrong often. He wanted me to be grateful that he was willing to look past. She gestured at herself, brief, not self-pitying, whatever this is, the size of me, the certainty of me. She folded her hands on the table. You are the first man who has ever looked at me like my size is a fact and not a problem, like my certainty is a quality and not a defect. I didn't say anything. You picked up that hammer and I watched you, she said. The first time you came to fix the stovepipe, you picked it up one-handed off the shelf and you held it like it was part of your arm. And I thought, that man knows exactly what he is and exactly what he can do. He's not performing it for anyone. She unfolded her hands. I've been waiting for a man who knows what he is. I sat with that. The lamp was burning between us, very low now, and her face was in its last light and her eyes were steady on mine. Is that a yes? I said. She said, that is a yes. I want to tell you about a thing that happened after, not long after, 2 weeks maybe, in the cold spell before Christmas. The land office man had not entirely given up. He was the kind who didn't, and he'd made it known around town that he thought the situation was ridiculous. That woman with that blacksmith, as though marrying down were the only explanation a man of his refinement could arrive at. He said some things in the saloon on a Friday night. I heard about them Saturday morning from Hector Baines, who could not help himself. I didn't go to the saloon. I had work to do. What happened instead was this. On Saturday afternoon, Edith walked into the saloon by herself. She went at 2 in the afternoon, which is not when a woman of standing goes into a saloon. It's when the men who have been there since the night before are working their way back to the world, and when the afternoon trade hasn't started yet, and when the room is at its emptiest and its quietest and everyone in it is paying attention. She stood in the middle of the room and she said, loud enough to carry to every corner, I understand Mr. Aldrich has been explaining my choice of husband to his friends. I want to be clear that no explanation is needed. I chose Cole Briggs because he is the best man I have found in this county and the best tradesman in this town, and because when he looks at me, he sees exactly what I am and doesn't ask me to be anything smaller. I'm done with smaller. Then she walked back out. I heard about this from 3 different people by Sunday morning. What I felt hearing it, I'm not going to try to dress it up with the right words because I don't think I have the right words for it. I'll just tell you that I sat at the edge of the cot in the back room of the smithy with my elbows on my knees and I held it for a long time. That she'd done that. That she'd said that, out loud, in public, about me. Not that I needed the public claim, but she'd made it anyway because she'd wanted to, because she thought it was true, and because she didn't believe in leaving true things unsaid. I'd spent 11 years in that town building a thing, one piece of iron at a time, and I'd always known what I was building, and I'd always known it was solid. But I'd never quite let myself believe it was the kind of thing that a woman like her could see clearly and choose freely, and then say out loud where everyone could hear it. She could, and she did. We were married in February on the 14th. The date was her idea, which I think was her quiet way of having a joke, though she said it was just the first Saturday when the circuit preacher was available and the weather looked promising, and maybe both things were true at once. The service was in the church and it was small. Hector Baines was there because there was no keeping him away, and the hotel man and his wife, and Gus Harker, who was one of the few men in town who didn't have to look up at me, and a handful of her customers who'd become something like friends in the months she'd been in town. The land office man was not there. I did not think about him. Edith wore a dark green dress she'd made herself. Not for the wedding, she said. She'd made it in November for practicality, but it happened to be the nicest thing she owned, so she wore it. She carried no flowers. Her hair was up. She was the most complete thing I had ever seen. That was still the word. The preacher read the words and we said our parts, and then he said I could kiss my wife, and I did. Simple, brief. Her face tilted up to mine in the thin winter light coming through the church window, and her hands were on the front of my jacket, not holding on but resting there, the long fingers open and flat, the weight of them something I could feel through the cloth. That was the moment. I won't describe it beyond that because I don't think it needs more. We moved into the Alderman house together in February, the night after the wedding, and began figuring out how two lives built separately fit together in the same set of rooms. It was not always easy, and I won't tell you it was. She had her rhythms and I had mine, and there were nights in that first month where I lay awake listening to the way the house settled in the cold and thought about all the small adjustments that two particular capable people have to make when they decide to share space. I thought it was like the latch, the original and the matched piece, made separately, fitted together. Takes a little wearing before the action is smooth. By March it was smooth enough. I built the smithy onto the north end of the house across the spring, a proper attached shop with a covered walk so I could go between the two without going through the weather. This was a bigger job than the original smithy had been, because I wanted it right. A good foundation, the forge positioned for the draft, the roof pitched steep enough to shed the snow load that came every 3 or 4 winters and had taken other roofs when men guessed wrong. I poured the slab in April. I framed through May, with Gus Harker helping 3 days a week because I needed someone who could work at height without getting scared of it. Edith helped with the framing on the days that Gus wasn't there. She was good at it, strong and precise, and she didn't pretend otherwise. She had grown up on a Wisconsin farm and she knew the work, and she could read a level and hold a line, and she didn't get impatient when something had to be done twice. When I needed a second set of hands on the ridge beam, the hardest lift, the piece everything else depended on sitting true, I told her what it was going to take, and she nodded and took her end. We got it up together. She held her half while I got mine set and drove the peg, and then we stood back and looked at it in the early evening light, and she said, "Straight," and I said, "Straight," and that was all the celebrating either of us needed. She kept the dressmaking shop going through all of it. This impressed me, if I'm honest. The smithy build meant noise and sawdust and men coming in and out of the property at irregular hours, and the house was rearranged for months, and none of it interrupted her work schedule by more than a day or two. She had customers who needed things on time, and she got them what they needed on time. She kept 2 appointment books, one for fittings, one for deliveries, and she worked the books the way I worked the forge, with a particular intelligence about the order of things, what had to come first for everything else to follow from it right. She was good at it, I mean genuinely good, not just competent. She understood cloth the way I understood iron, what it could do, what it couldn't, where it would hold and where it would fail, how to read the grain of a thing and work with it instead of against it. A dress that is cut wrong in the grain will pull and distort no matter how well you sew it. She knew that the way I knew that iron worked into the wrong grain will crack under stress even when it looks sound. It's the same knowledge in different materials. We talked about it once, late at night in the kitchen with coffee, and she said, "Everything has a grain." And I thought about that for days afterward because she was right, and it was the kind of right that kept opening up into other things. Her business grew, and within a year she had more work than she could take on alone, and she hired a girl from the Mexican settlement south of town. Her name was Lupe, a small, quick woman of maybe 20 who had grown up sewing, and who Edith said could match any stitch she put in front of her within a day of seeing it. Lupe was there 5 days a week by the end of that year, and the two of them ran the shop between them with an efficiency that I admired from a distance, the way you admire a well-built mechanism. All the parts doing exactly what they're supposed to, nothing wasted, the whole thing moving smoothly because it was correctly designed. And I had better work because she was in the other room. I don't mean she helped, she didn't mostly. That wasn't her place and it wasn't mine to ask. What I mean is something harder to say. I'd always been good at the work. I'd known that. Hobbs in Denver had told me so, and I'd believed it because he was not a man who said things he didn't mean. But knowing you're good at a thing and having someone who understands what the thing is, look at it clearly and name it right, those are not the same experience. When she said that first time with the latch plates, better than I expected, and then later in the saloon in front of the whole town. He's the best tradesman in this town. That man knows exactly what he is. Something settles in you when words like that are said by someone who knows what they're talking about and has no reason to say anything other than what they find. Not pride exactly. Something steadier than pride. Like the work has a witness now, and the witness is true, and that changes what the work means. It changes what you mean, I suppose, what you are to yourself in the quiet. I still pick up the hammer first thing in the morning before the forge is lit. The habit is too old to break. But it's different now, not just to feel it, the way I used to remind myself I was still alive. Now I pick it up and I think about what there is to do, and what I know how to do it, and there's someone in the next room who knows that too. Knows it clearly and chose it freely and would choose it again, I believe. I believe that. I'm telling you all of this because I don't know. Because it happened and it's mine and I've never told it straight through before. I've told pieces of it. Edith and I have talked about pieces of it over the years, the way you circle back to things that matter. But I've never laid the whole line of it out from one end to the other, from the hammer in the dark to the latch plate to the Sunday dinner to the ridge beam to the girl with the needle in the back room. Let me tell you something about what it does to a man, working in a town for 11 years and being seen without being known. I don't mean this bitterly. I'm not a bitter man, or I try not to be. But there's a kind of invisibility that comes with being the person who keeps things working. The shoe on the horse, the hinge on the door, the pipe that heats the room, when those things are right, nobody thinks about them. You only think about the smith when something breaks. That's the nature of the work, and I knew it when I chose it, and I don't resent it. But a man who has been at that kind of work for 11 years starts to feel, somewhere underneath the practical knowledge of his own worth, a doubt. Not a loud doubt. A quiet one. The doubt that asks, does any of this matter to anyone who isn't paying you for it? The doubt that asks whether what you're building, one piece at a time, adds up to something that a person who wasn't transacting with you would choose to stand next to. I'd had that doubt for a long time. I'd never said it to anyone because saying it out loud felt like weakness, and I was not in the habit of weakness. But it was there, working on me the way the wind worked on the forge, not destroying anything, just constantly present, making the whole operation slightly harder than it should have been. Edith did not make that doubt go away by telling me I was good. That would have been too easy and too light to hold. She made it go away by being the kind of person whose word on the subject mattered, who understood the work, who looked at it without sentiment, who would not waste words saying a thing was good if she didn't find it good, and then finding it good, choosing it good, standing in a saloon in front of the whole town and saying so out loud. That's a different thing from being told you're worth something. That's being seen by someone whose sight is trustworthy. We've been married 6 years now. The shop is bigger. I added a secondary forge in the second year when the work grew past what one fire could handle, and a separate tool room in the third year, and last fall I put up a lean-to on the east side for storing stock iron out of the weather. The house is bigger too. We added a room in the back when we thought we needed it, and we still think we needed it, though it turned out different from what we'd planned. I won't go into that, except to say that what you plan and what you get are not always the same thing, and after enough time, you learn to hold both with some grace. The land office man left Haskell Crossing 3 years ago for reasons that had nothing to do with us, and no one missed him, and the territory of New Mexico is applying for statehood, which will change some things and not others. The wind still comes down the canyon at an angle and hits the open front of the forge and either fans the coals or kills them, depending on its mood. I've stopped arguing with it. I've stopped even noticing whether I'm winning or losing. I'm just working. But I notice her. She comes out to the shop most mornings, not to help, just to look in, the way she looks in on everything she cares about. Direct, clear-eyed, nothing wasted. She'll stand in the door for a minute with her coffee, watching the fire, and then she'll say something or she won't, and either way she'll go back inside. This morning she stood there a little longer than usual. I was drawing out a piece of wagon axle, long work, and I had it in the fire and I was watching the color of the heat come up, the dull red first, then brighter, working toward the orange I needed. She was quiet. The wind was at it. Then she said, "You always know when it's ready." "The color tells you," I said. "Most people can't read the color," she said. I pulled the axle out and laid it on the anvil. It was the right temperature. I could see it and I could feel it through the tongs, and I knew. I picked up the hammer. "You can," I said. After a while, she watched me make the first strike, the ring of it filling the shop, the iron taking the shape, and then she went back inside. That was this morning, and that's all of it. The hammer's still warm.